I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, Tilo, Emilia, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H., Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we get underway with this edition of the show, I have to remind you that I am currently without an advertiser, meaning that this show is now entirely listener-funded. It is you, the listener, that will decide the fate of this show going forward. I do not make all that much money from doing this full-time. I'm certainly not rolling in anything like Joe Rogan dough. And I'm scrapping by, but I'm happy to do so because I believe this is an important project that provides education on everything from politics to pop culture. So please, if you can, consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, we have two separate segments on this edition of the show. Later, we'll be talking to the American Prospect's Macy Stacher about his piece in the American Prospect entitled Waffle House Workers Challenge the Southern Economy, which is about how Waffle House employees are unionizing for workers' rights and better treatment at their job, along the way challenging Jim Crow-era labor policy in the South. But before we get to that, we'll be speaking with Demand Progress's Emily Peterson-Cassin. Originally, I reached out to Emily and Demand Progress to discuss the letter that Demand Progress, AFL-CIO, the NAACP, and other organizations signed in support of FTC Chair Lina Khan. Lina Khan, if you don't know, is going after corporate monopolist interests in the U.S. with help from Jonathan Cantor of the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice and others. Recently, billionaire Reid Hoffman donated millions to the Kamala Harris campaign and then went on to talk about how he'd like to see Lina Khan removed from the position she has at the FTC. This has, needless to say, generated a good deal of controversy. We'll be talking about that, but also the breaking news about the Google antitrust lawsuit. A judge has declared that Google is a monopolist. Google is a monopoly. What does this mean for the antitrust movement, the anti-monopoly movement in America that has been gaining steam since Biden's election? I know that this show has been very critical of Biden, and I haven't always talked about it, but there has been good developments on that antitrust front under the Biden administration. I'm just calling it like I see it. That doesn't mean I think, we all have to say Biden is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but there has been improvements on the antitrust front in the years since Biden's election. So we'll be talking about all that. We'll be talking about the significance of the court ruling I mentioned earlier and how it's a big victory for the antitrust movement. All that and much, much more in the conversation to follow with Emily Peterson-Cassin of Demand Progress. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very happy to be speaking with. Emily Peterson-Cassin is the Demand Progress Education Fund's Director of Corporate Power, and we're going to be talking about antitrust cases, Lina Khan and the attacks on her by billionaire mega donors, and the big ruling that happened in the past day involving Google, where a judge declared, Google is a monopoly. It's monopolist. We'll get into all of that. But first, maybe, Emily, you could tell my listeners a little bit about Demand Progress.
Sure. Hey, it's so great to be here. Demand Progress is an internet freedom, Netroots progressive nonprofit. We've been around for several decades, and we focus on things that make the internet freer and better. So, big campaigns have included net neutrality, anti-surveillance work, and also antitrust.
You guys were co-founded too by the late great internet hero Aaron Swartz, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. We try to be guided by his spirit, particularly when we're dealing with corporate control of information.
So I initially wanted to have you on to talk about Lina Khan and the letter that Demand Progress, 2020 Vision, and a number of other groups, the NAACP and other organizations signed supporting Lina Khan after these mega donor billionaires like Reid Hoffman and Barry Diller have basically called for Lina Khan of the Federal Trade Commission, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, to be sacked by a potential Harris administration. And to me, this is billionaires trying to influence, policy. So can you speak to that in that letter?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the kind of thing that is so blatant that when you see it, you just go like, what? I think basically what happened is these big Democratic donors came and went on TV and kind of demanded a return on their money in terms of firing Lina Khan. And I think what that means is that the anti-monopoly movement is gaining momentum. And with that momentum is going to inevitably come pushback. So in the letter, we are hopeful that the Harris administration is going to stand up for Vice President Harris's past actions on monopoly and also support the Biden administration's just a landmark investment and progress in the anti-monopoly movement to make the economy work for everybody. There's enough room in the economy for many more businesses to thrive. And especially when all the air in the room isn't taken up by monopolists.
When you're trying to explain, the importance of antitrust and the sort of anti-monopoly movement in this country, sometimes I have to explain to people in detail, this is why Lina Khan matters. This is why the work of Jonathan Cantor at the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice matters. I think sometimes people don't know what we mean when we say antitrust or we talk about being anti-monopoly capitalism. Maybe you can talk about why these issues are so important.
Oh, sure. First of all, I relate. It is a very wonky area, but it's super important because I think people can relate. I certainly can to the level of frustration and higher prices that comes when you can only get a service that you're looking for from one provider. I think there's also a huge level of risk that comes with that. So we saw that in, for example, the Microsoft CrowdStrike outage a few weeks ago. And I think you experience it a little bit every time you're looking at a service and you think like, why is it so hard for me to get uh, why is it so hard for me to buy a Kindle book on an Apple device? Like, why does it have to be that way? The answer is it doesn't. Uh, these are companies that have been very successful, and success is great, but it's not great when you use that success and power to cut off innovation, um, and not allow for progress for other companies. And it is, in fact, illegal. Over the past 30 years, the FTC has been lax in enforcing the anti-monopoly laws that we already have on the books. And that's allowed these huge businesses to form in the way that they formed. Now we have to undo that, like, 30 years of laxity, and it's a really tough job. But Lena Khan has been leading the FTC, and the DOJ under Jonathan Cantor have really stepped up to try to make progress in chipping down companies that hike prices and make our lives a little bit more difficult in the name of pure profit.
Yeah, it's fascinating seeing the reactions to Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor. Sometimes I'll be clicking through channels, and the one day, maybe a week or so ago, I stumbled upon Jim Cramer yelling about how horrible Lena Khan is, and how horrible Jonathan Cantor is, and oh, this isn't good for corporations and big business. And then, I looked into Lena Khan more, and I saw that she was interviewed by Jon Stewart recently, of The Daily Show. And he was telling her, Apple, when I had my Apple show, I think it was called The Problem with Jon Stewart, they didn't want me to have you on the show. And I guess
Mm-hmm.
the big question that leads to for me to ask you is, why are there so many people that are so afraid of Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor and what the Biden administration has done with antitrust?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, having monopoly power leads to political and economic and societal power, right? So when Lena Khan or when we take on a company of this size, it that is a powerful interest that is being held to account by um, democracy, by the people. So it is natural that um, that would get pushback. I also think um, because it hasn't been done for so long, I think people think that this is the only way it can be, and it serves these powerful interests when you think the development of the internet in this way was inevitable and it is unstoppable. And that's not true. And so when you hear people saying, like, this is terrible for corporations, you know, I think that it doesn't comport with history. Something people forget is that way back in the 20s, once Standard Oil was broken up, they got richer because it increased the competition across the whole economy. So I can see why they're afraid, because change is difficult, and they anyone who has power is afraid to lose it. That's a natural reaction. Um, but it is going to lead to an economy that works better for more people.
Yeah, and I mean, I think people have to understand, we are impacted in really material, concrete ways by the corporations that are engaging in anti-competitive practices or monopolist practices, And I think, as much as I can be critical of the Biden administration on any number of issues, the Biden administration has actually been really good with this. I mean, they're going after RealPage, this rent pricing
Mm-hmm.
company that's using algorithms allegedly to, do price fixing. So, and that
Yeah.
affects, people at the ground level, just not even corporations, just this affects everyday citizens. Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. And on price fixing, the FTC just issued in the past few weeks what's called a 6B study, which means they asked several corporations for information on how they use algorithms to set their prices. This is, the kind of most scary example of this is when it's not when you're on the internet and you're looking at, running shoes and they show you an ad for running pants. It's when you are looking for a house and the algorithm can figure out exactly how much you should pay based on your characteristics, including protected characteristics. It's dangerous to civil rights. It's dangerous to equality. And it's the kind of thing that our existing antitrust laws were designed. Well, they weren't designed for it because it's an algorithm, which they didn't have in the 1920s, but are able to prevent. And it's the kind of business practice that those laws were designed for, because those practices are enduring.
So, in the past day, we've seen some very, very big news involving antitrust and Google. And Demand Progress has released a statement headlined with "Judge rules that Google is an illegal monopoly." For people that may have missed this story in the past day, or they're living under a rock, what exactly has happened?
Yeah, so the DOJ under Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Cantor, who's the AAG for Antitrust, has been, along with the FTC, suing several of these companies for anti-competitive practices and illegal monopolization. And they have suits. They have another suit running against Google. They have suits running against the FTC and DOJ together. Between them, have against Amazon and Apple and all the big internet companies, saying that you are using your power to illegally, against the law, stop other people from entering a market and cutting off competition. And when you have more competition, you have more innovation and lower prices. So the suit has been ongoing for a while, and we just got on Monday a decision from the district court in DC on that ruled in favor of the DOJ for a lot of the case, and said that Google is maintaining an illegal monopoly in search. This is a huge win. I think we really should celebrate it, because you do have to take a moment to celebrate wins when they come. It is I haven't gotten all the way through it yet because it is 280 pages long. But I think that goes to show that the reasoning there is extremely careful. And it's my hope that this is the first of many decisions that we're going to see, that kind of confirm what our intuition is, because it's easy for us to look at Google and think, like, this is a monopoly. And now it's we have a little bit of legal confirmation of our gut, which is great.
The thing I heard from, I was talking to a family member about this, and they just responded with, "But isn't Google the best because it provides the most effective search engine?" And that is the reasoning I've seen deployed by people who don't like this ruling. How do you want to respond to those folks?
That's a great point. And I think the answer is maybe. Maybe Google is the best. And now, because they're going to be like allowing people to compete with them, we're going to find out. But the real thing that Google has been doing that is the heart of the suit is that they are not allowing other companies to reach that level.
Right. Well, that's why to me, the whole, well, Google's search engine is so effective, but that's not the point of the lawsuit.
No, right. And if like businesses, winning the most customers is great. That's not something that anyone wants to prevent, but we just want to make sure that everyone has a fair shot to get there. And so, Google will now have a chance to prove whether its search is great or whether they just had enough power to block competitors and buy space on competing devices in order to cement their monopoly and cut off avenues for other businesses to grow.
Going back real quickly to that letter in support of Lena Khan that Demand Progress and other organizations signed, I noticed that the AFL-CIO signed it, and a lot of my listeners are very interested in labor and
Yeah.
workers' rights. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see the antitrust agenda or the anti-monopoly movement in relation to the labor movement and workers' rights?
Yeah, great question. So they work together hand in hand. One thing that you see when there is decreased competition is there is also decreased competition for jobs. So if you live in a town that one big company moves into and crushes out all the other companies, all of a sudden you only have one place to get a job. And it's in a business or a warehouse that then controls the wages for the entire area. That's called monopsony. And it's something, and it is something that we see a lot. And it has very damaging effects on the labor market, especially if you think that's something that we worry about, for example, with Amazon, where there's kind of one Amazon warehouse in the community that everybody needs to work at. And now, because they have this power over hiring in an entire region, they can artificially keep wages low and also take action against collective bargaining. You see a lot of anti-union activities in those huge companies too. So more competition for businesses means lower prices. It also means higher wages. Higher wages and more worker power.
So another interesting aspect of this whole antitrust movement, the anti-monopoly movement, is I think it in weird ways it may, and maybe you'll disagree, I don't know. I think it can maybe transcend some of our partisan divides. Because, this isn't, I think conservatives in a weird way could get behind this if they're for the idea of free market competition, because what antitrust is fighting against is anti-competitive practices. And I think for those of us on the progressive left, we're very skeptical of corporate power and the consolidation of corporate power in this country. So I think there's ways in which this movement has legs for both sides of the political spectrum in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. Because it is at its core monopolistic practices on the part of one company. It's a market failure when a consumer can't choose, is cut off from the full panoply of choices that an informed consumer could make. That's a market failure. That's not what a true free market operates like. And that's why the antitrust laws have gone back to like time immemorial, because it in order to facilitate a more open marketplace. And you have seen politicians, even like JD Vance, out there supporting Lena Khan, the more kind of populist folks that can see how monopolization and corporate power hurts everyday people.
So what do you think the ultimate significance is of this ruling? I mean, this judge literally called Google monopolist. So
Yeah.
that's a big deal. But I know you haven't gone through all the pages. But how significant, how much of a landmark is this, and why?
I think this is a huge deal. Um, I but it's sort of the first half, because the next part of the proceeding will be remedy, which means, okay, so Google's an illegal monopoly. Well, what are we going to do about it? And there are several options. You could issue a fine, you could require, um, various conditions about the way the company operates, or you could break up Google. You could mandate that certain businesses be spun off, and that they then will compete with each other, and they will be um, more appropriately sized to compete with other companies in the markets that they have, rather than being a gigantic behemoth that I think I said earlier, like sucks up all the air in the room, so there's not room for everybody. So I'm very, very hopeful that we are going to have the breakup solution. I'll be watching that. But this is a big deal, and I hope it's the first of many.
Just a few more things briefly here. Other than Google, and this landmark case, where where are the other energies when it comes to the antitrust movement? And I specifically wanted to ask, for people that don't know, what has the Biden administration done with antitrust? So what has Lena Khan done? Because I'm not sure that everyone knows what has been occurring in the past 4 years, and I do want to shed light on that.
Yeah, well, I talk a lot about Google because the uh, thing just happened, and because I'm concerned with big tech and the internet a lot of the time.
But there's
But
also like
the
Apple,
yeah
Amazon, yeah.
this yeah, but also the Biden administration and the FTC have been tackling monopoly in all areas of the economy. One that I want to bring your attention to is pharma. So they and groceries. Like, these are everyday businesses that people will see effects from. The Biden administration, way back at the beginning of the Biden administration, when we were all young, uh, issued an executive order on competition the um, in the United States, and it laid out a vision for a much more fair economy, I think. And that ethos has really been part of it's gone throughout the economy, throughout the government in the whole administration. So and it extends to um, blocking more mergers. Notably, Kroger and Albertsons tried to merge, which would have created a grocery monopoly across a whole lot of the United States. And they cut that off so that there's still competition and there's still lower prices in a time when people are getting squeezed by grocery prices.
I wanted to
Um,
talk more about that because one of the questions I was going to ask you was, how do monopolies affect us as consumers?
right. So it comes down to power. When I mean, the point of a corporation is to make money, and that is not bad. That's not a bad thing for a company to do. But when it turns so that the company has so much power that they are able to extract what's called monopoly rents, they're able to extract more um, than is fair from their customers without providing the goods or services that would be there in a more fair market. That's when you have a monopoly. It exists in a lot of different contexts, um, and it raises prices, and it also stops innovation. So, I mean, the famous story, uh, it does. The famous story is Kroger Albertsons, where all of a sudden you're only going to have one choice of grocery store. You can't look through the um, newspaper and find like which grocery store is going to have the best deals for me this week. All of a sudden, you know, you only have one choice. When you only have one choice, that the business in charge of that choice has their only motive is to hike prices.
This even happens with like the pharmaceutical side of things too.
Yes. Oh, yes. It is pervasive across the economy. It's notable in the funeral industry. There are only a few providers of coffins, and so coffins are very expensive. It's hard to get a coffin aside from a few small, you know, huge providers that control a bunch of the market. And I think I wish I had this number, but they're I mean but it's a real cost to consumers, and it's thousands of dollars for per family every year that comes from extractive monopoly rents. And when you start to have competition, you have not only cheaper prices but also better services, more innovation. The part of the reason, to go back to the internet for a second, part of the reason that Amazon and Google were able to develop and thrive was because in the 90s, the DOJ sued Microsoft for being a monopoly. And when Microsoft was broken up and brought down to the right size, other companies began to thrive, like Google and Amazon. And now, that went a little too far and we got to dial it back. But it's a great example of how innovation in particular is harmed when there is a monopoly actor.
So I also saw, and if you can go a few more minutes here, if that's okay.
Oh, sure.
I saw that Demand Progress is also involved in a push for, the NVIDIA antitrust investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that? What's that all about? I haven't read as much about this, so.
Yeah, so that's a really good example of when you have a monopoly in a stack of companies that's providing a certain service. So the service that we talk about the most within NVIDIA, they're a chip designer. Their components are essential to building servers that support generative AI. So those chips are super duper in demand right now. And what we're seeing is there are companies that want to design chips that will compete with NVIDIA. And when they go to get funding, the funders are hesitant to fund them because they say NVIDIA is unstoppable, and they will come and crush you. So it's not worth our investment to fund a competitor. We also see that when NVIDIA sells a chip, they don't just sell you the chip and they say thank you. They create a subscription plan. They bundle services in a way that cuts off competition from other companies that might be able to provide something other than the chip. So I've been very encouraged to see that the DOJ is looking into NVIDIA. I think a lot of people are. And it goes to show that even when, there are parts of the AI stack that have a lot of competition right now. Like I think there's a decent amount of competition at the top. You can choose between various, kind of ChatGPT or, the different generative AI services that you want. But, when you look a few levels lower, well, they do all have to run, they require enough compute power that they have to run on servers that, are only the hugest companies have. And then when you look a little bit further, there is only one company that has the chips to make this go. And so when you open up that level of the stack to more competition, it has positive effects through the rest of the stack.
Are there where else would you like to see DOJ or say a Harris administration, if they continue with the work that Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor and others have been doing? Where do you think the incoming administration should focus their attentions? Are there any cases you would like to see them take up in the future?
Oh man, what a question! There are so many. Let me tell you a few things that are like in progress that I'm tracking that would go into the next administration that could really make a huge difference. The first one, as I mentioned, is getting started on the 6B study with algorithmic pricing. I think when I'm really looking forward to whatever the public results of that study are, I am hopeful that it leads to some kind of rulemaking or enforcement action. The other one I want to highlight is the FTC started a few years ago what I call for short the commercial surveillance rulemaking. This is a rulemaking that would that could, if depending on what the FTC decides to do, significantly limit the ability of internet companies to extract monopoly rents through surveillance. So that means, very classically, the crawlers, the data brokers that follow you around the internet, and then they are able to know who you are, know what you're willing and able to pay, and therefore take away your choices as a consumer because they're only going to present you with things in a certain range.
I think I've heard you talk about this before with regards to like Facebook's algorithms and sparking racial bias concerns.
Yes. So it is a big civil rights issue, especially when you think about a financial or educational market. And again, it's a market failure. If there are customers that aren't seeing ads for certain products and aren't buying certain products because of an algorithm, that company is not getting that income. That consumer doesn't have full choice. That's not what a market is supposed to do. And I think even with the like increased attention on AI, the idea that we're going to have a perfect predictor of what a person will do is not right. The idea is you are going to be able to control what a person will do based on what the algorithm is showing them. And it's not because the algorithm has gotten into your brain and is controlling you. It's because it's cutting off your choices.
Before we close out, I actually think that people should know about the fact that there is actually a long tradition of antitrust voices in the United States. I mean, we could even go back to like Teddy Roosevelt. Do you think we're rediscovering that voice?
I think so. I think there are a lot of, when you look into the past, there's so much of it that should be discarded, but you can also find ideas that really led to more equity and more justice. One of those ideas is the anti-monopoly movement in the 1920s. That era saw the rise of uncontrollable wealth in a time when people were struggling, and they took action to make the economy more fair. And eventually that led to, in the next like 20 or 30 years of American history, it led to a lot of prosperity. And that kind of, that era of prosperity, noting, of course, that it was prosperity for some people and not others, right? The wealth that created for the boomers has led to dedication to getting back to that level of prosperity.
I think there is that long tradition, though, going back to, earlier generations. And I do think people are rediscovering it.
Yeah.
And real quick, I wanted to mention, I don't know, there was an article that I recently came across in Politico, and I thought it was very interesting. It's entitled, "The Next Generation of Law Students is Obsessed with Lena Khan." And it's talking about how you have a new generation of lawyers and young people that are getting into this antitrust stuff. And the critics are calling it hipster antitrust. But, I think they're just angry because, even if a billionaire like Reid Hoffman gets his wish that, Lena Khan will be gone with the next administration, you have to contend now with all these young people that have been inspired by her. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Like, I do think there is now, this is bigger than just Lena Khan. It's bigger than Jonathan Cantor. And I don't think it's going to be something that, billionaires like Reid Hoffman can necessarily stop in its
Oh,
tracks. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. The cat is out of the bag. We talk a lot about Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor, and they have been fantastic leaders, but the movement is bigger than them, and it is seeing momentum. Like the Google decision is momentum. The all of the studies we're talking about and the progress we're seeing is momentum, and that momentum will carry on regardless of um, who is the next chair of the FTC, and I mean, knock on wood, even who is in the White House.
I was going to say real quick in that regard, and then I'll let you go. It's interesting after we had Reid Hoffman calling, doing this corporate wish casting is what I would call it, of saying, oh, Lena Khan needs to go at the FTC, blah, blah, blah. We had Ed Markey and others posting their pictures with Lena Khan. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it came on the heels of people like yourself, people like myself, people like David Diane at the American Prospect and Matt Stoller at the Economic Liberties Project saying, hey, look at these billionaires going after Lena Khan. We like Lena Khan. We support the work she's doing. And I think a lot of people are paying attention to that. I think the Harris administration has to be paying attention to it. And, I think there's just something very hopeful to me about that we've seen um, people mobilizing in support of Lena Khan. And I'm noticing it more and more with politicians. Like I said, Ed Markey and others are now, posting pro Lena Khan tweets and whatnot. So I think it says something there. I think we've mobilized in support of her.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's really refreshing to see because, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, antitrust is pretty wonky. The FTC, like, who even knows what it is, right? And to see the way that people can now understand how it affects everyday people, these issues affect everyday people, and how important it is even to legislators that this work continue. It's just evidence of the momentum I was talking about earlier, and I find it all really really hopeful. I think we're in a hopeful moment.
Well, let's leave it at that. I want to thank you, Emily, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work and the work that Demand Progress is doing?
Yeah, great. It's been so fun to be here. I hesitate to ever direct anyone to the website formerly known as Twitter, but you can find us there at Demand Progress. Our website is demandprogress.org. I would encourage you to sign up for our newsletters, and they will keep you updated on all the things we're up to.
Next up, the American Prospect's Macy Stature joins us to discuss his reporting on Waffle House workers unionizing and challenging long-standing, rather unfair, to put it mildly, labor policies in the South. What these service industry workers go through is just horrifying. I don't know what to say because I was at a loss at some of the things Macy described in this conversation. It's really just awful what these Waffle House workers have been put through. And I know Waffle House is the butt of a lot of jokes, but the treatment of Waffle House workers is no laughing matter. So with that in mind, let's get right to it with Macy Stature, author of the new piece in the American Prospect entitled Waffle House Workers Challenge the Southern Economy. Welcome to Parallax Views, the guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with, Macy Stature, author of the American Prospect piece, Waffle House Workers Challenge the Southern Economy. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
So maybe just to start out, we could talk about the basis for this article. So what are the issues that workers at Waffle House have been facing at their place of employment?
Sure. Waffle House workers have been dealing with a host of significant issues for years, perhaps throughout the 68-year history of the diner chain. Low pay is one of those most pressing concerns. Notably, but workers up until June, the lowest wage workers were paid was $2.92 an hour, just above the federal tipped minimum wage.
That's insane. Wow.
Yeah, and what's concerning about this tipped minimum wage system is that functionally workers are subsidizing their bosses paying of their paycheck when workers over the course of a full week don't accrue over 725 or at least 725 an hour through the combination of their uh, tipped wage and tips. That only in that situation does Waffle House bump up the pay the tipped wage to the full 725 or whatever the difference is to make sure that they're making 725 an hour. It's a pretty horrid system that, again, as the article talks about, is rooted in some racist practices post abolition. But before I getting into that, beyond pay, there's kind of reports of missing paychecks, which kind of further destabilizes a number of workers' financial situation, and was actually the entry point for one of the workers who's led this organizing effort, Cindy Smith from Conyers, Georgia, a nearly 30-year server at Waffle House, who missed paychecks for upwards of 6 months. Corporate gave her kind of a runaround, said that she was late on healthcare premiums, which she says wasn't the case. A lot of these practices, especially service work franchises in the South, are extremely pervasive. Wage theft, notably, has the highest occurrence in the Southeast, and a lot of it goes unreported because a lot of these state governments don't have requirements, more rigorous labor laws and employment protections beyond the federal government's kind of minimum kind of thresholds. And often these state governments don't have labor departments or enforcement agencies to protect workers. So when the federal government doesn't have a champion of workers' rights, which for the most part has been the case in the past kind of 50 years throughout the kind of neoliberal era, a lot of workers kind of don't have recourse. And in the South, which has historically been extremely anti-union, and a service industry that is also extremely anti-union, the collective bargaining framework that we have in the United States, which occurs at the worksite level, makes it really difficult for workers to organize, especially in the context of kind of anti-worker employers who engage in ruthless union busting tactics. So, before Cindy Smith actually got involved in the organizing, she wasn't familiar with what a union was to begin with. I mean, this is kind of the reality for so many working class people. Union density has been on a steady decline for decades, and it was kind of astonishing to me as someone who grew up in New York State, which has one of the highest union densities in the country, to find out that people didn't know what unions were. But that's kind of the political context we live in.
I was going to say it's wild because I remember, it wasn't that long ago that I was in college, and, just like 5-10 years ago, people would say to me, unions are still a thing. And that was in like a pretty union city, Pittsburgh, PA. So, I mean, that is a thing where a lot of people are unaware of unions.
Yeah. And so in this kind of specific context, the Union of Southern Service Workers, which actually started as a break.
This is the Union of Southern Service Workers is the name of the union?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
USSW. So the Union of Southern Service Workers actually started as a branch of Fight for 15 in a Union, which was a SEIU campaign. The southern wing of it called Raise Up the South, and so USSW kind of came on the map in 2022 using kind of a non-traditional cross-sector union of low wage service workers who knew fundamentally about kind of the history of kind of the racist Jim Crow history that was kind of intertwined with an anti-labor and anti-union history in the region, and also understanding that workers in order to fight for their right to collective bargaining, to kind of leverage their collective power in the workplace to demand better working conditions, that they'd have to adopt some pretty non-standard tactics. And what's notable about the Union of Southern Service Workers and the organizing that Waffle House workers have done with the support of the union is that they have not pursued legal recognition for a bargaining unit with the National Labor Relations Board under the National Labor Relations Act. What started over kind of concerns about missing paychecks, as well as a mandatory meal deduction program, which I can kind of explain in more detail, and the kinds of severe safety concerns that Waffle House workers face on a daily basis. That
when you say the safety concerns, by the way, you mean like, I know the article mentions that there's been like sometimes fatal incidents of like armed robberies, and that workers were trying to bring this to the attention of the company and it fell on deaf ears.
Yeah. So it has fallen on deaf ears, and in November of 2023, workers with USSW delivered 13,000 petitions, 450 of which were worker-signed petitions from Waffle House, as well as support from community members in the region, or organized labor workers at USSW workers at other locations, demanding Waffle House implement 24-hour security program, a safety protocol around hurricanes. The chain is notably open in the most severe weather conditions, and has a FEMA disaster response index named after it, because of how consistent their hours are. 24-hour security, a health protocol, safety kind of protocol plan, a living wage of $25 an hour, and an end to the mandatory meal deduction program. But when workers delivered that to the Atlanta headquarters, the corporate front office, they kind of told them to bring the petitions to the loading dock, threatened to call the police on them. And when the petitions were brought to the loading dock, workers reported the company throwing out the 13,000 petitions. This is the kind of environment that they're dealing with. These employers like Waffle House, have no tolerance for unions, and it's frankly it's like nothing I've seen before. It's kind of frightening the ways that the company has responded. And in fact, Cindy Smith, again a server at a 30-year server at Waffle House in Conyers, Georgia, told me that at numerous points she's been held at gunpoint, including in front of her son, who she's had to bring to work at times because of limited childcare. I mean, it's frankly some of the most disturbing things I've heard, and kind of no communication from corporate. She communicated that she heard nothing from corporate outside of her kind of immediate manager, who was supportive. The company has not addressed this culture of violence and kind of the social media trends that have played into it as well, which workers at Waffle House don't find funny.
By the way, it sounds like maybe I was underselling it, saying it fell on deaf ears for corporate. It sounds like corporate just spat in the face of these workers, locked them out of the headquarters in Atlanta, and basically threw out those petitions. So, I mean, that's just brazen to do that to these workers. But go on.
Yeah. So Smith has throughout, before it became a social media trend with these violent brawls on social media, she's been dealing with this her kind of entire time at Waffle House. So that's really why they're pushing for the 24/7 security and more kind of worker informed safety protocols, because frankly what workers are dealing with is untenable. I know there's a great piece from More Perfect Union that covered a story that a Waffle House worker in Tifton, who his coworker, when he went out for a work break, he was shot and killed right outside of his Waffle House location, and the company immediately reopened. So and didn't notify many workers what had happened, and expected them to move on with their workday as after their coworker was murdered.
Real quick, I just wanted to add to what you were saying. In case people don't know what you mentioned earlier, that there's the brawls that happen at Waffle House. I'm literally looking at a Twitter page right now called Waffle House Fights. And if you type in Waffle House brawls, you'll get an autocomplete on Google. There's all kinds of videos that go viral. And I'm looking at an article from The Independent. Why are there so many fights at Waffle House? So there's videos of all these fights happening. And what the thing is, your article is like the first to really look at like, how is this affecting the workers there? And why is corporate not doing anything to ensure worker safety? So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of kind of worker accounts on social media, some smaller posts. I saw a YouTube video from this kind of Waffle House worker who went kind of viral from this brawl where she caught a chair that a customer threw at her, and after she went kind of viral, she needed to kind of step back from the work, but she communicated that she had been blacklisted by the company at every other kind of location, and she had nothing but kind of love for the company publicly, but before this incident. So it's frightening how they're responding to these concerns, and even workers who aren't necessarily putting themselves at their job on the line to communicate the dangers and the workplace safety concerns that they face on the job.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that. I mean, beyond the workplace safety concerns, you write in this article, I mean, the Waffle House beats out IHOP and Cracker Barrel when it comes to just employees earning under $10 an hour. I mean, this is like, I commend anyone that, is able to survive on the type of non-wage they're giving. I mean, you said it was what, $2?
$2.92 an hour before they responded to workers' demands and rolled out this wage hike program.
So there's a few more things I want to delve into here. I want to get into how workers have responded to the lack of corporate dealing with any of these issues. But first I want to talk about the meal deduction policy, because I've worked in restaurants before, and it was always a given that you would get a free meal at the places I worked at in the Northeast. And I was like just horrified that apparently they're not even afforded meals by Waffle House, these workers. So what is the deal with that policy?
Yeah, so workers at Waffle House are charged $3 per shift for a meal, regardless of whether or not it's cooked or eaten. A lot of the time, workers don't have the formal break time and meal breaks to eat their Waffle House provided meal. And in terms of what Waffle House workers are making, $3 a shift, out of your paycheck is pretty significant. The policy varies based on kind of location, region, how rigorously it's enforced. But it is not a kind of a type of paycheck deduction that I have seen. And when I talked to the former wage and hour administrator from the Department of Labor, an Obama appointee, who was notably had his renomination to the Biden administration's Department of Labor defeated by Mark Kelly, Kirsten Sinema, and Joe Manchin, mentioning Mark Kelly because of the recent Veep stakes and some of the concerns that organized labor had around that. But he said that David Weil said that the deductions are pretty standard for uniforms, for lodging expenses, but the kinds of deductions that penalize workers regardless of whether or not they engage in a kind of a specific practice or if they kind of don't require whatever the employer's charging them for. He expressed that it doesn't seem in line with kind of laws protecting workers from wage theft. And that's not surprising to me. He's also done quite a bit of research about how the franchise business model kind of has forced franchisees to engage in wage theft because they often don't have kind of many mechanisms to control profits and price setting capabilities when they're buying kind of a full kind of package from a franchisor like Waffle House. Their Waffle House appears to be moving away from this model, but still has around 20% of their locations are franchised. And in fact, those franchises have the highest incident of wage theft violations with the wage and hour division.
So then I wanted to talk a little bit about the tipped wage and how that sort of ties into a broader Southern economic development model that's really been regressive towards workers over the course of many, many years.
Sure. So I spoke to Chandra Childers, who's a policy analyst at the Economic Policy Institute, and who has authored a series of reports with EPI about about economic policies in the South that are, quote, rooted in racism, that named for the title of the report. So some of these practices that characterize the Southern economic development model and include a tipped wage, which originates in a practice that former slave owners, businesses, and employers engaged in post-abolition, so that they didn't have to pay Black service workers. They could rely on the benevolence of customers to tip Black workers pennies. So in federal law didn't institute a tipped minimum wage until 1966. So you functionally have an extension of slave wage, kind of slavery light practices for decades after abolition. I mean, in addition to kind of the tipped wage, the Southern economic development models, also characterized by austerity measures, business deregulation, again, minimal worker protections. You have state laws that preempt more progressive cities, majority Black cities in the South from regulating their own businesses, from passing their own minimum wages, and it's a pretty concerning anti-democratic practice. I mean, additionally, there's kind of low tax rates, again, regressive austerity measures, controls over social welfare programs that the Southern states receive funds from the federal government over, but kind of notably that Medicaid expansion states refusing to take federal funds to support working people and struggling families. So that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg, what the Southern economy looks like, and it's based on a false premise, attract capital and investment, which we know that the South is not, it does not have has not benefited from a booming economy because of these policies.
Yeah, it's not been good for workers, and it hasn't been good for the South as a whole either.
Yeah. Again, it's a race to the bottom system that, again, only benefits a small few. But the way that many have talked about, employers like Waffle House have talked about it like it's a family. It's kind of a like a safe and great place to work, which is completely incongruent with the experiences that so many workers are articulate. And I just throughout my research, I just thought it would be kind of interesting. Here, there's a bunch of puff pieces on the importance of Waffle House in kind of Southern culture.
Wait, really?
Hospitality. Yeah.
Tell me more about it. I'm not aware of this.
Yeah. So, Southern culture, Southern hospitality, the Waffle House is, placed on the side of the highway, 24-hour service. People see it as kind of a reliable source of affordable diner food with a kind of helping of Southern hospitality. They say, customers are coming into a waffle home. And there's an interesting kind of, again, puff piece from the Atlanta magazine that dates back, was originally published in 2007. One of the co-founders who Joe Rogers Sr., who before he recently passed away, but before passing away during COVID, he became a billionaire because of the boom of Waffle House. And I found it, interesting. He discusses Waffle House as a place where there's no class distinction. And that's clearly far from any reality. And I'm sure that if the Waffle House, management and corporate spoke to more workers like Cindy, and I'm sure they already know that's not the case, but they have kind of not recognized any of the organizing efforts that are going on, and kind of are pretending that this wage hike is occurring in a vacuum as they've recovered from inflation and they've recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic. It just happened to have occurred immediately after a series of strikes at four Waffle House locations.
How did the strikes come to happen, and how did they get the wage hike eventually?
Sure. So the strikes originally started in South Carolina, in Columbia, in May of 2023, and spread to Durham, North Carolina, as well as two locations in Georgia, which has the highest concentration of Waffle Houses in the country. Again, notably where the chain was founded, in Covington and in Conyers, Georgia. But a handful of workers, sometimes even just one or two, have kind of intermittently gone on strike between these locations, and these are atypical organizing tactics that are obviously still protected under federal labor law, but workers are risking a lot more without kind of union recognition, and it's a strategy that seems to have worked across different kind of service industry employers in the South. USSW workers have gone on strike at kind of convenience stores, other fast food chains over the intolerable heat conditions in the workplace with no air conditioning and some of the hottest recorded summers in history. And it has kind of provoked a groundswell of support and media attention that I think has put a lot of pressure on these employers and a spotlight onto the kinds of practices employers engage in, and some are obviously kind of changing their ways, and or at least in part, in the case of Waffle House rolling out an unprecedented wage hike, that you kind of the first of its kind.
So these workers did get some victories.
Yeah, yeah. So workers at Waffle House have received an immediate wage hike to $3 an hour in June, and will see their wages increase to, I believe, $5.25 an hour by June 2026. In some locations, will also have wages climb a dollar or two more based on kind of what they say is cost of living and kind of business, like differences in business expenses. But what the Waffle House CEO Joe Rogers the third communicated in his announcement of the wage hikes to workers is that these workers will be paying for their wage hikes in because the company is going to expect higher quality service and harder work from their employees, which workers like Smith, who kind of have been at the chain for decades, scoff at. These workers are making poverty wages, are some of the most kind of charismatic and hard workers that I've seen. And it's something, again, that is just kind of characteristic of the expectations that these employers have for their workers. Again, often working some employees to death.
So, but before we close out, I hope you understand when you said that Joe Rogers III earlier was in this pup piece talking about how Waffle House is a family. The reason I sort of like smirked or laughed a bit was because, I mean, the reputation I've always seen for Waffle House, and this is not me attacking anyone that works for Waffle House, but I think the public perception has always been pretty low of Waffle House in my experience. So I don't know what Joe Rogers is kind of talking about there. And I guess I remember people in school used to call it awful waffle if they had to go there. But that's another thing. I think people have overlooked this story because I think Waffle House has been the butt of a lot of jokes in the, online and in like, whatever you talk about it. And I think what gets overlooked because of that is, these are real workers and real people that are trying to make a living working there. And I think people overlook their stories. So what I wanted to ask you was, and I know this wasn't in my notes, but what led you to want to tell this story? Because it's not a story that's been told often. So what led you to it?
Yeah, I guess I was originally assigned this story, but I am kind of I do have kind of a labor and also industrial policy beat. I was kind of shocked when I heard that workers, that service workers specifically were organizing kind of successfully in the South. Again, is something that has been unprecedented. I was kind of aware of how notorious or kind of infamous Waffle House was for these fights, and knew that these kind of social media, that these posts on social media don't in a vacuum, and a lot of the kind of things that have brought Waffle House to the national stage, people have joked about for a long time. But again, a lot of this is coming at the direct expense of workers, and from as someone who kind of grew up in a family with grandparents and great grandparents who were union organizers and leaders who kind of fought for some of the kind of transformative labor rights that we have in this country when they first came here and worked as garment workers and teachers, I kind of saw the parallels in that experience with the kind of organizing that Waffle House workers and service workers and Southern workers are doing to fight for a dignified work, for a living wage, for safety, security, and comfort, for the ability to kind of live in their own homes and pay rent and get food on the table.
I think you put it best in the article when you said, so you end the article by talking about how Cindy Smith expects to see her hourly wage rise from $2.92 an hour to $8.45. And then you say, well, now she can find a place to live with her son and no longer have to ask that question to herself. Am I going to have groceries this week? Or am I going to have to pay the light bill? And that's what it really comes down to. I thought that ending of the article on Smith's experiences was really invaluable because that's what this is about. These workers are having to choose between paying for their electric bill or being able to get groceries. And that's just not acceptable. No one should have to live that way in a 21st century society.
Yeah, and even with this win, a living wage in the region that Cindy Smith works in is estimated at $24 an hour, according to the MIT Living Wage Index. And yes, Smith is receiving that significant raise and does have tips on top of that, but it's nowhere near what it takes to ensure that a working family has financial security and economic security. And I think there's again, Waffle House is just the tip of the iceberg here. There's thousands, if not millions of working class families in the South who have similar experiences, who have bared the burden of an extremely regressive anti-worker state policies and a federal government who either doesn't have the capacity or isn't interested in ensuring kind of the bare minimum at times. So there's so much more here that I think everyone should be drawing attention to, and I hope people follow the organizing work that the Union of Southern Service Workers is doing to kind of fight back against the remnants of Southern aristocracy and corporate greed that pervade the economic world in the South. And they're just one union that's doing some really important work here. Notably, UAW has had some wins in the South, but there's a lot more organizing and investment that needs to be done for workers to be able to fully exercise their rights to a union, right to a family sustaining wage, and again, something as basic as the right to the life and safety on the job. And so, yeah, again, I hope people continue to follow the work that organized labor and Southern workers are doing in the region.
Last question I got to ask you, because I was really impressed by Cindy Smith's story and her sort of getting involved in union organizing and labor rights. What was her hopes for the future? Because it sounds like she's not backing down anytime soon. And what was your impression of where she stood when you spoke to her, and what her hopes are for the future? Maybe I should ask her this myself. Yeah. Maybe I should contact the union.
Yeah. It would. I think it would be great if we could get if we could put more spotlight on some of the workers who are doing this kind of really important organizing. But what she expressed to me is she sees this as a fight over the future of the region, over the Jim Crow legacy of the region, and I think she and many others see this as an opportunity to build a multiracial, progressive working class kind of union movement.
Well, hey, Macy Stature, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. I hope we can talk when your next article comes out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next up, the American Prospect's Macy Stature joins us to discuss his reporting on Waffle House workers unionizing and challenging long-standing, rather unfair, to put it mildly, labor policies in the South. What these service industry workers go through is just horrifying. I don't know what to say, because I was at a loss at some of the things Macy described in this conversation. It's really just awful what these Waffle House workers have been put through. And I know Waffle House is the butt of a lot of jokes, but the treatment of Waffle House workers is no laughing matter. So with that in mind, let's get right to it with Macy Stature, author of the new piece in the American Prospect entitled Waffle House Workers Challenge the Southern Economy. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.